Hello everyone, today we talk about Bohemian, Polish and Hungarian economy during the 13th century, looking mostly at dynamics of population and agricultural development, national, multinational coexistence, because this is the point in these political and social organizations that the various estates at some point were mixed. In origin, they had the various nationalities had a greater or smaller concentration in the countryside as opposed to the towns that were growing. So we made lots of videos actually about these countries, especially in a comparative sense, literally like these ones, like talking together, say Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, sometimes also the Rus together. It depends, right? We managed to cover actually pretty different groupings, highlighting what were the sort of major, usually political institutional development in their statehood, actually the fate of the same towards the end of the Middle Ages, towards some essentially elective dimension where the oligarchy took over everything and prevented like the crown to concentrate enough power. Different timing, telling the truth, also because there was a lot of, as you know, dynastic accumulation of crowns exactly in this area. Then there is also a more common side of the story that starts probably from the environmental situation. I mean, from the migration era and before, as you know, these were some of the least populated, urbanized, and sort of connected areas within Europe. Right, and of course, in the High Middle Ages, we witness the important development of proper kingdoms, right, principalities that succeed in stabilizing to fundamentally base the same, more or less the same countries geographically that we see today, with all the, of course, the national and cultural ethos that came with that. And we'll talk more and better about that foundational phase that is really striking, considering the success overall that, especially in this period, these polities achieved, because of the lack of any prior statehood, and again, the sparse population, few communications, right? So there was something very willing about this process that, however, was conferred by the authority, an authority that was always countered to some, especially by the nobility, to some important degree. And then there is also a lot of international involvement in this. Some of these powers were more falling under, for example, the German sphere of influence. The others were sort of more eccentric. And it took time, in fact, for them to different times to stabilize, right, on the basis of this closer or far away distance from civilization, in a sense. There were also other random factors. Another element that these countries had in common was important degree of German colonization during the so-called Ostsiedlung. That was a broader phenomenon starting from antiquity, even the end of the migration era, witnessing sort of backs and forths, different areas, this wider, in fact, Central European region. And this process, as you know, was actually crucial for the development of, say, monarchies, because it was in many ways the foreigners that were more loyal to the local monarchies, as opposed to the ethnic nobilities that, as we've seen, were that more centrifugal force. There were also other problems stemming from the general destabilization that the steppe world had caused in these areas, right? This had not been just more inhospitable, like with a colder climate, but especially in perspective, had been destructured politically to some degree by the constant contact with the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppes. This phenomenon also affected these various countries to a different degree, right? But there is no doubt that this area was struck, right, more directly by the passage of the Mongol armies in the years 1241, 42. There would be further invasions, right? Poland was invaded thrice by the Mongols. There was a relentless struggle with the Golden Horde, a very deep political intertwinement, and as you know, so forms of disgregation. Think about what happened to the Rus and the beginning of the Russian Palatinate gravitation around more the West, the same Roman Church, and more, right? So really secular phenomena that would, in fact, come to define even new nationalities and languages and culture that, as they in part had already been formed. What is actually important to stress here is that before the Mongol invasions, we've seen it very often in the video about the Rus, the latter was more similar to Central Europe, way more similar to Central Europe before the Mongol invasion, right? That would eventually open, even just in perspective in the following year, to also the 14th century crisis, and so would have a dramatic impact on Eastern Europe to a degree that, in fact, we come to distinguish it from the central one today. But before the 13th century, it was much less obvious thing, especially as far as properly like the Kievan Rus was concerned, especially the Russian Palatinate, so later, as we were saying. And yet the Mongol waves had, and especially the first one, that was the most devastating, gave an important impulse in countries like, especially Poland, to the sort of overall, like, and sort of more rationally directed reorganization of the country. It is true that also in Central Europe, the Mongol invasions actually damage the process of statehood because of the essential benefit that the oligarchies at the end of the crisis had received in relative terms to the rest of the population. But this also allowed these powers on the shorter run to sort of modernize, even to some extent. For example, like in Poland, the process of stronger stone encapsulation, and it was a post-Mongol phenomenon because also of the massive destruction, the evidence also of the previous piast-like fragmentation weakness, essentially, that the country found itself in. And so it sort of boosted a recompaction of power, a greater connection also with the outer world. Thus, the Mongol disaster, which was even more evident in this country as being properly defeated in open field by the Tatars, gave, however, when the latter withdrew, impetus to the already ongoing, this is what we'll see now, growth and expansion of urban settlements, as well as the process of colonization of empty regions, right? And this dynamics had been going on from a while, right? The 13th century especially is the peak of medieval expansion. You have in these countries, especially Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, like the full westernization as far as the broader Frankish model was concerned. This was particularly evident under the feudal point of view. For example, the development of a true military class, right, providing with that heavy cavalry that at this point was really undistinguishable, especially at the elite level, from, say, the neighboring German or Italian counterparts. The same can be said in part also for the Rus. At least the Rus was parts of it, those who had not properly ended under the Mongols, so were trying to escape that, were, as we've said before, like come closer, like to important games of power through dynastic marriages, and more. We will see this hopefully soon. Of, for example, the Russian involvement in the battle, say, in the Austrian succession, the Babenberg extinction, and the rivalries between Bohemia, the Habsburgs, and Hungary in the region. In general, we have covered all these areas, and we will keep doing it. But let's focus here more systemically, right, on this, say, regrowth phenomenon that these post-Mongol invasion survivors managed to resume with even more impetus, right? And how, of course, this was internationally interconnected, because, of course, when you have to repopulate a region, right, you will take up some model of reference for this, and you need the manpower, the labor force. You have to stabilize these areas, even just militarily speaking. You have to reinforce the defenses, erect new fortifications, and then you have to repopulate these people. You need labor force, you need immigrants from other countries, right? There's something similar going on in the Iberian Reconquista at this point, as after Las Navas and the, say, collapse of the Islamic front, basically the Christians began to repopulate certain areas that had been frontiers for centuries and centuries. They also sent other rulers in the south. Naturally, it's a different context, but the 13th century witnesses this in different areas, like the west here is properly overflowing. Also, innerly, within itself, from the more populated, more developed areas, in these more peripheral ones that could benefit from such injection of resources, especially, again, the principalities that were there, like finding new allies, right, by internationalizing the local state building, and therefore being stronger against the local resistance pressure. Under the rule of Bela IV, Hungary, for example, experienced a period of growth marked by the establishment of new castles, towns, and villages that, of course, had sort of always existed in this royal context, but that were growing further to an ever more systemically intertwined rate. The royal and episcopal towns, characteristic of Central and Eastern Europe, where, as we've seen, it was essentially the elite that controlled everything. There hadn't been like strong third estates like urbanism, and so also an autonomous phenomenon of communal development, at least to the extent it was happening in Western Europe, gave way to some conglomerative settlements comprising trading and mercantile quarters predominantly governed by German law. The origin of these settlements had been, as we just said, sort of different from the one of Western Europe. These countries at large had not been under Roman rule, Hungary in part, but it had never been a particularly urbanized area. As you know, Pannonia at large in Roman times was a military frontier with relatively scarce development. So, in many ways, also what the kings and bishops had tried to put together in terms of local settlements under their own lordship, because that's what the main objective naturally was from them, were essentially born out of a cluster of previous villages of some sort, and so had sort of substantially different physiognomy from other areas. There was a sense, of course, of liberty within this world. The fact that monarchies and the same centers had evolved later from the rest of Europe hadn't actually made, still by this point, the oligarchs so hegemonic as that they would become in the later Middle Ages. The level of personal freedom had always been very blurred in this, of course, clientary connection to the more powerful rulers, but the kings especially had tended to grant, in virtue of their own public authority, so in theory like an absolute one juridically on the rest of the people, as long as the people of course agreed, because of the pre-existing customs of the nation that was understood just as, you know, represented by the elite. That's what, and so also their clienteles, and so the thing was that intertwined, had remained something like, I don't know, you are, for example, as we'll see now better with some other estates, I don't know, a royal client. As such, you would enjoy certain specific privileges of liberty, but what you have to go to give in exchange is, of course, some important subordination to the kings that would essentially, yes, provide you with this right and would make you live in a slightly better status, but still tied to the land in a condition that could be, say, measured as a level of serfdom compared to what was happening in other parts of Europe, especially in the communes, but not all. German law had been, as we were hinting at before, the sort of gold standard for charter, say, city rights to these various towns that were in fact quite sort of more modest than also the German ones. Weren't fully, like, Germany was very hybrid in this sense, like that hadn't witnessed the greatest urbanism in Europe, etc. But Germany was the most culturally important country in terms of in proximity to Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. These countries had been gravitating one another around the Germanic Empire, and therefore that's what they would have essentially gotten, also as a model for urban organization, right, and juridical identity. The entire region here, we're talking about Central Europe, essentially was characterized by a network of small towns rather than large urban concentration. German settlers were known as Nemeti, the French and Walloon ones as Olazzi and Latini, constituting the primary source of innovation, especially in the countryside. They were bringing with them, as they were being settled locally, expertise in husbandry, viticulture, artisanry. So this wool craftsmanship, this wasn't just a socio-economical issue, right? It's also a military one, a political one, a literary and artistic one. They had the better crafts, they had the more advanced models, also business, administration. And in fact, many communities, many settlements were to be shaped along their patterns. In Hungary, you have newly founded settlements in the northern and eastern frontier, respectively around Zips, that is Szepesseg, and southern Transylvania. I also talked about the so-called Saxon. As a matter of fact, most of them were Rhenish communities in Transylvania, and the video about the region throughout the various eras. Importantly, the German toponyms remained, right, still bearing testament to the medieval Ostsiedlung. The renowned Hungarian wines, especially the Vina Seremiensia of Francavilla, were produced in vineyards established by these new settlers, right? These were frontier areas, you know, that the frontiers of Rome had been the one of the vineyard, right? And the milder climate had allowed from these guys coming from some of the also warmer areas of Germany, and or as we've seen also some Romance land, bringing their own viticulture skill with them, right? It wasn't much about really the technique per se. It was mostly a social issue, right? The Hungarian king was allowing these people to settle down, as we will see now, by being exempted from taxes to an extent, in order to incentivize the growth of these settlements, which gave the local communities an extra edge compared to the locals. And not entirely, as we will see now. It's wrong to assume that these new German towns were founded and inhabited just by ethnic Germans or even Romance settlers, right? There was, of course, a convergence also from the locals, but it depends also on which locals. We've seen, for example, how ethnically complex Transylvania really was, right? How, for example, the blacks still at this point are living at the edge, even though they were the more numerous in many areas. Thus, it was very much a matter of investments, right? In 1224, the King Andrew II issues the famous charter known as Privilegium Andreanum, so Andrew's privilege, that was establishing the so-called Saxon community in the Siebenburg district, stemming from the fact that there were these 7 centers of German settlers. You know, that those would last until 1945, basically. And this is an aspect of Middle European culture we tend to sort of overlook, especially looking at as if, you know, it were normal, right, by nationalistic and or socialistic hysterical ideologies of the 20th century of forestaters and mass society that were just neatly defined like nationally homogeneous countries. Of course are not, right, because you can also erase, you can actually cause a real ethnocide, but also renaming people just something that they're not doesn't change that they will keep having their own genetic, cultural, historical background that of course makes things very different from what you would like them to be. Surely, however, it was probably an ethnic redrawing that did not pertain to European tradition, the true and deep Ancien Regime one. And that was the beauty of Central Europe in many ways. And in connection with the Privilegium Andreanum, the king basically allowed, in return for a payment of 500 silver marks and the provision of 500 armored soldiers, the new settlers to be exempted from dues throughout Hungary. Right, so they had also sort of freedom of movement unknown to the other subjects, exactly in order to maintain the commercial contacts with, sometimes probably the fatherland, the country of origin, incentivizing, in fact, the settlement of other foreigners in the same way. Right, as you understand, this didn't come just for free. Of course, they had to pay a tribute, and also they were again exempted from dues, but they, in virtue of this enrichment, they had also to provide with a military force. And so this would, in perspective, also make them feel ever more, let's say, part of the kingdom's destiny. Right, because they have to fight and die for it as well. And so this was their new home, their community, really was. It was their universe, out of which, like, at a short distance, there was somebody else's universe, but still, in an other bigger universe that granted their own existence. This was particularly important in medieval mindset as in a traditional one. Looking at Silesia, that was an important mining region, Boleslav the Tall, also known as Wysoki, brought miners from Misnia/Goslar to Złotowija. This was done for the same purpose. There were precious metals to extract, and those Germans had the technique, the experience from other mining areas. Boleslav's son, Henry the Bearded, continued his father's policy and was emulated also by the bishops of Wrocław and Krakow. Right, so Krakow was the seat of the PS Polish Seniorate, right? So if you control that duchy, you were essentially the king of Poland, even though things could get definitely more complicated. What is relevant here is that we look essentially at the southwestern fringe of Poland. It's all actually Polish heartland, but this is the closest one to Germany. Silesia during the 13th century especially was the most Germanized of the Polish lands. You can see it from the panoply of Henry the Pious, for example. In his tomb effigy, this guy fell at Lenica together with the Teutonic Knights, etc. And you realize that he is armed and armored in an identical way to his German counterparts, right? So it's all part of it, you see, also because mining was about metal extraction, arms and armor production as well. Everything we do, right? And while there were attempts to restrict German law to foreign newcomers, which had, as we've seen, that idea of if you're a foreigner who will be more dependent on the king because the locals will not look at you with particular, friendship, and especially the nobility that doesn't like these people to become pawns in the hands of the kings. Henry the Bearded decided to extend German law, so all its conditions of liberty, to Polish settlers as well in 1229. This was, of course, an understandable policy because if you had, Polish manpower, labor force, you would want to use it, especially if this came from the lower estates that weren't threatening the same elite from which the Polish dukes came from in the first place. This process was known in Latin as locatio, right? So location, literally. And it entailed specific technical requirements, including organized and measured field layouts in planned villages. There were pre-established patterns of administrative and literal, territorial settlement that facilitated, of course, the homogenization of the process, the order, the general capacity of control. Naturally, every settlement was different, but the mode, right, was very similar, and this helped in sort of also strategically locating these communities. In towns, this led to the establishment of a new street network in a chessboard pattern, very, again, square, very orderly, featuring essentially an open, usually rectangular market square that you can admire still in the main Polish cities, as very typical of the country, and not just in Poland. The cemetery, the parish church, the specialized quarters of the artisans, of the craftsmen, then some town boundaries proper, and defense structures, essentially ditches and walls. Of course, the community was entitled to an important degree of autonomy in the management of this infrastructure. The new towns were granted a charter, as we've seen with essentially German, in the German custom. It could be modified, by the way. There were different ones, as you know, within the same German law, right? There was the Magdeburg one, the Lübeck one, and so on. And again, also, every charter was sort of different, after all, because it was negotiated to some extent by the city council and the princely authority. Typically, the first locatores were foreign-born individuals of typically also urban origin, right? So there were people already familiar not just with the German law per se, but they were essentially gentry, right? They had connections in Germany, they had access to resources, so they were the middlemen that had to carry out this full also resettlement, like the population movement from Germany to Poland and beyond, and they would thus acquire also a certain status. Right, they were rewarded with a higher, let's say, condition right within the community. In fact, as a reward for finding colonists, the locator was granted the position of local judge. It had properly juridical power, and acting naturally on behalf, however, of the local lord. That is to say, the town was part of a lordship. There was somebody else above, right? In Poland, like you had, of course, the kingdom, but of course there were these dukes that, as we've seen, were doing things also pretty autonomously, to say the least. And that was a sovereign authority that subcontracted, right, this further autonomies. And if the lord, and so there were also other, as we'll see now, other lords down the hierarchical line. If these were not present, they could not exercise justice. That normally was the higher and the lower one. So these people could sentence people to death, just to be practical about it. These local locatores were the ones that had the power on their behalf. This role in Poland was known as skultos, the school dias essentially. In Polish it's called skolthys, something like that. This is the Schultheiß in German, or other etymology, other semantics here, voit, which is the advocatus, right? And these were terms like respectively from German and Latin that had sort of different meaning, but they all refer to fundamentally the juridical authority. It's somebody who was called properly to exercise justice, and it was a legal expert of some sort as well. Because, as you've seen, they knew of all the practicalities, all the material issues of the role. The latter office was the most frequently used term in Bohemia, while the former was more prevalent in Poland and Moravia. So you had this local variations, mostly to the different local language, but not only the different juridical, administrative customs, traditions. And by the way, these titles are still there today, right? If you look at some levels of the administration of these countries, that you find words that stem straight from essentially these Germanized terms that fundamentally date back to the Ostsiedlung. This is to be seen right in the broader Western Slavic vocabulary at so many levels. I talked about it in that video about, I think, the 13th century Polish infantryman. This is to be seen even in heraldry, right? Especially military terms, right? In the technical one, the ones coming, in fact, were with this properly technical innovations coming from the West, or styles, etc., that took essentially the term like of the dominant models that were coming to be were introduced as the most updated stuff locally. Nobles and knights as well founded new villages under the new law, right? This is also an underrated aspect. There were lords that literally said, okay, I want to establish this village and to rule over it, and I will essentially manage the thing myself. I will administrate it, and I'm responsible for it. They would thus acquire themselves the title of skolthys, and even and often appoint a trusted peasant of theirs to this role, right? There were also administrators. Think about the ministerialis tradition that, well, in Germany at this point was something else for the level of, say, military and feudal advancement of ministerialis power, but the idea that there was a head, right, of the peasants, of the clientele, the following, under this lord or another, like in a hierarchical organized community was, of course, establishing these relations. After all, the same etymology of administrator stems from, like, it's the guy who is deputy to the lesser things, ad minus, right? And so, of course, a nobleman just fights, right, as a knight in this case, even, and doesn't have to work, because the noblemen, the freemen, originally don't, right? There is somebody else working for them. Skolda is typically received between 2 and 10 1. I think it's pronounced, it will be butchering different Western Slavic names of land. This unit of measure, there was the Flemish one of 16 acres and the Franconian one of 24. This could vary. The point was rather this administrative land plot, right, rather than it's a bit like the mansus, the hide we have covered those topics for the earlier Middle Ages. They could be different in size. Some were also money fief, right? So the important was the equivalent, as it could be recognized in a commercial and legal sense. This also depended on the size of the village, the community, the productivity of the same land. So they would cost a different amount. Maybe even, in fact, they were smaller, they could be as fruitful. And this also was on the shoulders of those who worked on it. This land was, as we've seen now, exempt from dues and came with fishing and hunting rights for the lord, as well as the rights to inns and meals in some cases, showing how first was always an aristocratic management at the end of the day. And the Skultais also received a sixth part of the dues owed by settlers to the lord and a third of court fines, which was an incredibly remunerative chunk. In return, the lords were obliged to provide military service to the crown, as we've seen, individual knights, but also providing with some following that would have just fought for them, whichever cause would have deemed it fit and or sustainable. The needless to say, the development of these communities eventually could be substantial, and so there would be new arrangements, negotiations. What was important, however, were the fundamentals. First and foremost, the fact that this was a royal concession, so of course at some point you couldn't simply, like this obvious in feudalism, in the vassalic system, take away these privileges just per se, but they depended on a bond of trust between the king, so the public authority, and these beneficiaries. Now, the establishment of urban settlements during this period coincided with the creation of the new villages. Wrocław, that is Breslau, was granted the German law by 1214. As we were saying, this is all before, right, the Mongol invasion and the general reorganization of Poland. While Krakow followed suit by 1228, with a further foundation in 1257, which had to do, in fact, with the hurricane that had invested Poland the decade before. The Duke Barnim I bestowed Magdeburg law upon Stettin in 1243. The Baltic area, as we'll see now, was a bit like the crucial, say, way of expansion for the Poles that had called, however, the Teutonic Knights to essentially settle in the mouth of the Vistula to, in fact, dislodge the pagans, but eventually settling themselves there and effectively preventing until the 15th century the Poles from an access on the Baltic, which was a big deal. In 1223, Szierac was awarded a charter that was a modified version of the Magdeburg law that would later serve as a model for other Polish towns. This would be known in Latin as the jus fori sredense, because it came from Sierrach. And so this was the right of the forum, of essentially of the market of Sierrach. Right? You understand here in these towns like the importance of properly the market foundation per se. These weren't simply like cities that already came with an idea of civitas, of citizenry, of nobility, of the freemen. It was mostly just like market towns, right? Then you had Gniezno, recorded by 1239, Plock, founded in 1237. New towns were typically established outside existing settlements or in close proximity to them due to the difficulty faced by the founding landowner in purchasing all the land within the old centers from the local nobility and church. This was the reality in Central Europe. Practically the entire country was, again, under the nobility, and these towns wouldn't historically have, in fact, well, this is true also in Germany, all right, just by comparison, much of a chance to expand, like in a political, military, territorial sense. They sort of gravitated around this broader seigneuries, right, this landed estates that needed markets to, of course, connect their production with the world, right? The international market. We'll see now what kind of routes we're developing in Central Europe. There are examples of this. For example, Sonj was an old castellan center located on the river Dunajec. This is in the south of Poland, the border with Slovakia. The Duchess Kinga transferred the town of Sonj to new land by 1273. As a consequence, in 1292 we have Novi Sonj founded. This could also happen. It tells you again how volatile, after all, the same settlements really were historically, right? You can't simply transfer a city if this is, well rooted, urban sense. Prague gained German law between 1232 and 1244. Bohemia had become a kingdom proper less than half a century before, and under the Przemysl dynasty, the center had, as you know, flourished. It had been the most important one in the country since the 10th century, and it was rising fast, right? Especially, and thanks also to the greater proximity to the empire. In fact, it was within it technically, and receiving much more direct German influence. The country was also more compact. It had well outlined, and Prague, as a consequence, was expanding to the point that the famous lesser quarter of, in fact, Mala Strana was built opposite the old city on the left bank of the Vltava river. We are in 1257, so this is also normal, like suburbs, like growing and eventually being incorporated in the city. This is typical of many medieval centers, including ones of Roman foundation that at this point were expanding, in fact, beyond the old city ring. Now, the emergence of new towns revitalized ancient trade routes as well. This is true, for example, think about the Amber Road, right? It was all a Baltic-Carpathian connection. There were different axes crossing Central Europe and all the way through. For example, via Silesia and Bohemia, Pomerania, along the Oder River through Moravia and Greater Poland. And all these were, in spite of the, say, broader repartitions into Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, etc., they're very sort of self-aware. They were very autonomous also from one another. They were competitive as such, and there are some geographical boundaries, but it's also a pretty extended area, especially north of the Carpathians, where, in fact, from Germany, you don't really even technically have a real border, like any major barrier, there are so many trade routes also connecting more faraway countries that need essentially these countries to organize some cooperation for maintaining trade routes open amidst, however, enormous conflicts, political, military alike. Merchants from the lower Vistula towns traveled via Great Poland to the Baltic ports because, as we've seen, they didn't have the direct access to the sea due to the Teutonic presence. This formed, however, still, like for the Hanseatic League, I made a video about that some month ago, a major route that stretched across the Vistula-Bug riverway to Galicia, right? These rivers are not intercommunicating, but they're close, and in fact there is not much of a barrier between these countries, and as we've seen before, the Russian Palatinate would remain pretty connected to Polish Hungarian affairs for quite a while. Eventually it would be properly incorporated within the Kingdom of Poland when we look at the Renaissance. This would have all a series of, say, economical implications. They were mostly agricultural areas, right? This is important to stress. Also, the more southeast you went, and the least sort of urbanized and westernized the system really was. But it is important that Galicia was connected to Wrocław through such a trade route. Note should also be taken of the Novgorod-Lübeck route. That was the most trafficked one in the Baltic. There would be, especially towards the later Middle Ages, an increasing export of the Russian grain as far as Portugal. Also, Poland became a mass grain exporter from the 14th century, especially since the country was apparently spared by the most devastating effects of the Black Death, for which there was more labor force. It was, as we've seen, overwhelmingly agricultural country. And so you had timber, you had grain, and that all would strengthen these routes that, and for, again, apparently random reasons, in part also the same isolation of the system, maybe the fact that the Poles did not control the Vistula mouth sort of spared them in part from the Black Death. And so, but you understand how random that can be, or at least for reasons that we don't clearly understand unless very, very much an expert in the situation. Now, most of the pure silver used instead of coins circulated in major towns, which also had mints, of course, was a great public privilege. As you know, you can't have a mint unless properly the king decides that. These centers were some of the most important: Krakow, Sandomierz, Wrocław. These precious metals were largely in the hands of the large estates owners. In fact, silver was primarily used for large property purchases. Again, you have this precious metal and loss of land, loss of peasant. That's what happens. That's how so many Polish oligarchs would gradually build their extensive seigneuries and private armies in historical perspective. In Silesia, however, the local Brektate was employed for such transactions, so at some more some lower level thus, and this has in part to do with the level of fragmentation of the country. That I made a video about Silesia, and that, as you know, remains a bit of a frontier area. It had been more heavily Germanized. It had probably a more evenly spread wealth, where all some dukes that ended up like parceling this land in, I think, 16 entities. I also made a video about this area in the 16th century for the Bohemian crown lands in the Habsburgic in the Habsburgic Renaissance. Now, the Prague groschen, first minted in Kutna Hora from new silver mines under Václav II, would become the dominant coin in Central Europe, also because Prague was to become the dominant city in Central Europe, especially in the 14th century. Kutná was famously properly opened in a large to a large extent at this point, and this mining mining center, local deposit would be particularly instrumental for the building of the Bohemian kingdom. In the late 13th century, Silesia stood out with 35 of its 96 chartered towns boasting populations over 1,000 inhabitants, which, again, for Central European standards of the time is a lot, but it also tells you more or less what the general scale of, say, urbanism, we can so say, in Central Europe really was. In fact, in contrast with Silesia, Little Poland had only 10 of its 37 towns reaching this threshold, while Greater Poland had only 8 out of 39, and Mazovia 2 out of 4, right? Which tells you also how sometimes, but especially when you go towards the east, you have this important trade centers along important riverways mostly, but you don't have properly much of a urban fabric in the hinterland. That is especially typical of the Rus, right? Where properly the forests were even somehow in the hinterland separated from the major trade centers along the major Russian riverways. And you understand, of course, that the western you go, the more development you have. Kuyavia and Western Pomerania had 4 and 5 towns respectively with populations exceeding 1,000. These were the sort of the northern parts that had also sort of been autonomous, but they had never been as competitive as the German coastal centers, the German areas, and essentially the Baltic. In fact, ports that were not pertaining to that hinterland. The burghers of Krakow maintained closer ties with Hungary for obvious reasons. So it's very close, just to that kingdom, but also Silesia and Bohemia, then with northern Poland, which led them to support Leszek the Black against Conrad II back in the day, in the 11th century, or Henry IV and Vaclav against Lojek or Przemysl II. This was obvious, was that belt we were talking about before, like from the northwest to the south, the very south of Poland was sort of more the most important, the more dynamic part of the country, where the main centers of power at this point lay. The Void of Krakow, Albert, led a rebellion against Lojek in 1311 and 12. Lojek, for the record, was essentially the Vladislav I, the elbow high, and also known as Vladislav the Short, that had he was king of Poland, but had of course like a different. It was always the problem of the Polish monarchy, that it was about collectioning the various provinces that made up the Polish kingdom. There was always some rebel, and so there was some. We talk about, by the way, 13th century, 14th century Poland, if you are interested in this figure, right? He was pretty active also against the Teutonic Knights, right? And was trying to impose, in fact, like a pretty strong rule in the country. And therefore the advocatus of Cracovia, Albert, that was trying to preserve some autonomy in the most important city, like the one that, as we've seen, conferred the seniorate, the right to Polish kingship, essentially, had connections at this point with Silesia, as well as with the Luxembourg dynasty that was to install itself in Bohemia as well. And so that's why you have this also very political and long-ranged connection of the city council leaders that say trying to find a way out, some autocratic rule, right? This would be typical of many other situations. We have it, I don't know, even in Paris, as you know, during the Burgundian English period of the 100 Years' War, and these centers were trying to autonomize themselves. Was mostly like the Third Estate carrying this out, even against the monarchy. But Poland was much more messed up thing than even then 100 Years' War France, which is, a lot, definitely. Meanwhile, the citizens of Poznan were more focused on establishing contacts with Silesia than with Krakow, because they were trying to escape this sort of more northwestern direction. And Silesia, that again was not essentially capable of challenging at least the monarchic power that was increasingly settling in Krakow, was looked upon with favor from this towns that could say, okay, well, let's side with this Duke of provincial reality, but we at least are knowing that the Silesians are not going to simply exit, at least as there can be a duke of theirs that manages to control this or that territory, but at least the bulk of their power is going to stay. It's at least less threatening than the one that can emerge from Krakow. And these disparities in population growth rates across Polish territory, and as well as the diverse political allegiances of individual duchies, are reflected in these affairs. Now, there is a very important aspect of the mass migration of German, Flemish, and Italian settlers into the empty heartlands of Europe. That is the encouragement of also Jewish settlement in the region, right? This was not a new thing, really. The German and Romance population was something more renewed than some Jewish presence that had been around since the Kievan destruction of the Khazar Khanate, that, as you know, had been in part converting to Judaism, and as such scattered lots of namely Jewish subjects. That this is all a problem in some part probably of Orthodox Judaism today, because these people were not technically the descendants of the original tribes of Israel. So, as you know, there are different positions in Jewish culture about this, but they were Jews, of course, at the time, were recognized as such. And as we were saying before, kings in Central Europe were not just searching for foreigners to strengthen their control, but even people of a different faith would do in this sense, because they required an ever greater dependency on the monarchy to just be out there, to be recognized legally. The Jews had thus widely contributed also because of the fact they had been relegated on some occasions to money lending activities that were prohibited, in theory at least, to Christians in the development of Central European towns, especially some of the most important ones, including Prague, etc., from quite a while. The 13th century, however, witnesses a greater, let's say, population movement within Europe. There are lots of phenomena going on in other countries, saying Reconquista, where it seemed had always been like a large Jewish population, and some of these Jews start not as strongly as, for example, in the modern age, with in fact increasingly more persecutory and sort of large-scale changes in that sense. but to effect find new home in this land. The Jewish presence in Central Europe would have definitely a lasting impact on the Magyar and Slavonic societies until the genocide of the 20th century. There are interesting informations about this. Rabbi Eliezer of Prague, for example, wrote to Yehuda Ha-Hassid of Regensburg, on the Danube, right, Germany, in 1217, about the poverty of the Polish and Hungarian Jews. This is a constant, actually. These countries, this would, in fact, these are the roots also of the Jewish question from a social and economical point of view. The German Jews were, as a whole, not dramatically more prosper, but they were somehow more, say, they were slightly richer and more integrated than in the Polish and the Hungarian world, that, as we've seen, was also much simpler. That's a reason why it was much less societal diversity. More or less, everybody was a peasant, to make the long story short. And the Jewish communities would stand out, especially in the cities that, as we've seen, were not even particularly. There were towns, to be honest, most of the time. This information at the beginning of the 13th century by this rabbi is interesting because it also shows the international awareness of these groups, like how they were faring, and especially because of the connections that we've seen with German immigrants to Poland, Hungary, etc. Like about how do Jews live in this country, this other, what about you, what do you tell me about your community, and so on. And indeed, in the sort of westernmost part of Central Europe, Jews had it better than in Poland and Hungary. For example, they received charters from Austria in 1244, Bohemia in 1254. Hungary too, gave them in 1251, but still, they weren't living so prosperously. In 1264, King Boleslav the Pious granted the Jews of Greater Poland equal status with other estates, however designating them in this sense as servi camere, that is to say, members of the ducal retinue, right, and guaranteeing them personal liberty, freedom of religion, self-organization as members of a kahal, that, as you know, is essentially the local governing body of the European Jewish communities administering the religious, legal, and communal affairs, and that was recognized, was attached to the local synagogue. This was very important because, as we were saying before, the Polish kings needed desperately that support from anyone who wasn't the ever-growing native oligarchy, and the Jews would be subsumed in this mechanism to be particularly dependent on the monarchy. If you wonder why lots of anti-Semitism, of course, spread in that sort of nativistic sense, it is in this sort of not anarchic, but definitely sort of anti-centralizing, in fact, privatistic, oligarchic spirit of the Polish nobility that, of course, considered the average Polish native ethnic peasant lesser than a dog, but still was pretty vocal about the Polishness of it all, as like waving the Polish customs in an anti-monarchic direction. That's how they shipwrecked an otherwise very potentially gifted country, as you know, it was at some point in recent European history literally cancelled from the political map of the continent as a result of this, together with a lot of anti-Semitism that at some point was absorbed by the Fourth Estate, that had to find a scapegoat for having been, essentially servants of somebody else for the entirety of their national existence. That's always how it happens. In any case, the here the role of the Jews is very relevant. The Kahal that we mentioned functioned essentially as a court, right, to resolve the disputes involving Jews. Right here, every as we've seen, the personal right was probably the traditional one. You were identified by being part of a community by your personal law, right? As we'll see now, there were, of course, a lot of German Slavic inbreeding. Like, doesn't even make sense to try, especially in these frontier areas, to divide them. But you were Slav if you were under the Slavic law, you were German if you were under the German law. And you could find, of course, still today, like, people who are ethnic something, but they look, say, very ethnically, distant from the average. And considering, again, the steppe was next door, Kumans, Mongols left their trace also ethnically among these peoples. So similar charters were issued by Henry IV of Silesia in 1295, Boleslav I of Vinnitsa Javor in the same year, and Henry III of Głogów in 1299. And in these newly established towns, the Jews established their own organizational infrastructure. They enjoyed the urban privileges to some important degree. However, not as much as was happening westwards. The Jews spoke German at this point, largely, and in part because of the internationalization, the urbanization. In fact, there were lots of Germans in these towns, as we've seen, and given that they were involved in finance, etc., they were facilitated in connections by speaking German. It was really that language of the more dynamic side of the economy. And the ducal protection limited the same local civic authorities' interference in Jewish affairs. The Jews, as we've seen, were protege of the dukes of the crown, and it had to remain like that. As we were saying before, the relationship between the Poles, the Czechs, and the Germans within and beyond Bohemia and Poland were far more nuanced and complex than the modern stereotypes of Teuton and Slav would suggest, for so many reasons. The first one we already listed was essentially a strictly communitary political one. I mean, there were all these various provinces competing with one another, and if there was a division internally, it was evidently creating alignments that went beyond the context of ethnicity per se, right? They were mostly like unitary polities that had to mostly make the most of what they had, and were, if anything, just mostly in a social sense organized in a tendentially different ethnic way. As we've seen, typically the towns were inhabited by Germans, by some, of course, local native ethnic elite / gentry, plus the Jews, and the countryside was also, like, in part Germanized, but it was more dominantly native, and the social conditions much lower, of course. We see, however, how in fact especially the elites, because that's what is most documented in the first place, had sort of very complex relation to the ethnic aspect. The reactions, for example, to the German outsiders in Bohemia and Poland varied. In some Bohemian sources, we find anger and jealousy towards the Germans. All right, they are equated to Judas or Pontius because essentially they saw the Germans are more money-minded, making just their own business and being always ready to betray for their own interest, connected with the one of the ultimate authority. So this is interesting because later, like as you know, in the anti-Slavic, anti-Jewish ideology we were talking about, the Freikorps some week ago, this is exactly what the Germans thought of the Slavs and the Jews, that were almost just like a single race in their view, of cowards, of traitors, of backstabbers. This is quite fascinating. On the other hand, however, you see that there was also fashionable culture coming from Germany that was eagerly adopted, not just by the royalty, that was, as we've seen, acting a bit like, okay, I'm provoking the nobility by just becoming a bit more, not just German, but in this sense bourgeois. It's something we've seen, for example, also in the video about Louis XI of France, that in order to trigger the French aristocracy, he began to dress up as a merchant. And here the German was kind of that merchant, not only, but in part. But we see that actually both the Bohemian and Polish ethnic nobility was adopting German fashion at the same time. And of course, it was always a complex and double-threaded relation. There was some satire on the ethnic relations coming from Seifried Helbling, who was an Austrian author who ridiculed, in turn, from the other side of the border, his own fellow countrymen for imitating Czech mannerisms, which, again, is fascinating because it tells you also how in Austria, like, of course, like Bohemia, the Czech lands had always been sort of next door. They were sort of the all-time neighbors in the first place, a bit like the Hungarians, but a bit more civilized, and thus also in the more Germanized, more civilized guys had developed customs that Austrians could in part want to emulate, which is definitely fascinating. Austria was more advanced than Bohemian and Moravia, but at the same time it was something about the more sort of autocratic aspect of the Czech nobility that some Austrian aristocrat wanted to imitate. This happens politically every day. I mean, look at today's sort of political imitations or winking at some autocratic regime. Why? Because the people who do this would actually want to live in that? No, but they're provoking, they're playing a political card, and it's not a positive thing, but it's not also like the direct, like it's not the end of the world per se. But it's also from on the opposite end. Polish chroniclers during the same period here often highlighted the courteous relations between the Poles and the Germans. However, when some contingent need arose, immediately that perceived, quote, natural hatred between the Slav and the Teuton was suddenly recalled. Right? If you go in that video made on Ottokar II of Bohemia, I talk a bit about the German influence on Bohemian arms and armor in the first place, but there is a comment that I left in response of one of the followers who asked me about because I referred to one image that Ottokar II of Bohemia had used to actually talk of the Germans to bond more with the Poles, and so they were talking about their Slavic ancestry, the common, tribal customs at least compared to the more feudal and sort of, in fact, German spirit of the king of the Romans at that point that he was at war with. And there is all this, I listed the passage from from the source, and there you see like the snare of the Germans, this idea that these were outsiders, were aggressive, they had wanted to. That there is, I'd say, one should of course highlight, as we were pointing out before, that the difference between the Slav and the Teuton in a strictly ethnogenetic sense is a big deal of a challenge in this frontier area. But of course there is a tendency that cannot be denied, as much as the fact that the German had always been sort of the enemy of the Slav. Like the Germans had fit the broader Frankish world. They had sort of feudalized and westernized earlier. They had been more aggressive. They had been stronger. They had, in fact, started to colonize, to invade, to subdue, to conquer. And so the Slavs were aware of this, even if, of course, like Germany here wasn't politically outflowing beyond that. There were some territories in the northeast of Germany that were essentially taken away from Poland. Even in the same Silesia at some point would be part of some sort of more German dimension. It had been before, etc. Some local Slavic dynasties were Germanized. Think about in Ottokar's the second time, the Witigonen / Rosenberg, as in fact they would become, and how powerful oligarchs they were in Moravia, but how they, in fact, they turned their backs on their king and sided with the Habsburgs. So that could be very instrumental. It wouldn't be like trading their land to the Germans, but politically that was destabilizing the country rather much. And so it was difficult, it is difficult in fact not to see in the first place, even today, how politically, institutionally different the German and the Slavic and also the Magyar eras were in Central Europe, right, from one another. But mostly the Magyars and the Slavs being more similar level of societal development, just differing in other ways that were not as important, however, as much just the divide with the Germans. So one must always realize that both things are true. There was some level in which being German or Slav, especially from a social point of view, did not really matter, and other levels in which it mattered a lot, right? And all these dimensions would intertwine politically and socially. The historiographical notion, however, that persisted from the Middle Ages until very recently, like even up to relatively few generations ago, is that there were, for example, no Poles in medieval towns, that would have been all German, is unsustainable when faced with the evidence. The use of German names such as Konrad or Hermann to support this claim is misguided, because first, these names were common in Poland before mass migrations taking place in this period with the Ostsiedlung. The Ostsiedlung was, again, a very old thing. There had been Germans, of course, settling in what would become Poland even from very old time. I mean, there had been Germans in Poland, like in antiquity. Look at the Vandals, look at... but the... and they would cross these lands and they would leave their trace. They would remain sort of Germanic. Also, we are not really documented about properly the earliest times. But in some ways, there was also a matter of cultural imitation, or simply, again, I want to call my son like that, right? And the second generation immigrants themselves, as Germans, would often took Polish names. This is also very telling. For example, we know of the Comes Albertus Cognominatus Lica, which stands for Count Albert surnamed Bast, from Henrico, that, as you understand, even with all these Henrys in Poland, that was a German name actually, but it came together with this process of sort of cultural assimilation. There was, of course, from mostly the Slavic side, the need to be co-opted mostly in a German dimension, because again, that was the more powerful one. That's what would happen fully to the Kingdom of Bohemia. As you know, it was properly part of the Holy Roman Empire, differently from Poland and Hungary. But historically, there had been some possibility of these countries too to be part of a Germanic domination. And surely we have the Teutonic Knights in Poland and further northeast, but that's sort of a different thing. And yet, in fact, also, like in Hungary, was a very heavy German influence. We've seen it politically and militarily, also from Italy for that matter. So this is really typical of the situation would happen also in Greece, say, with the Latins settling. There is in, I don't know, with the Italian colonies in Crimea and the Black Sea, there is pretty much everywhere the broader Frankish sort of Latin world sort of expands in that dimension. So the assimilation of newcomers occurred relatively quickly through mixed marriages as well and local migration, but of course it wasn't enough to completely, say, eliminate differences. A Cistercian monk from Lubiach took pride in observing this, that after all, yes, Germans and Slavs were two separated groups, and the fact that we're talking about it, even for those and they were talking about it, of course, was the mere evidence of this. The same author, in fact, wrote about Poland. This vast forested land lay untouched and uncultivated. Consider this. This is a Cistercian. You know that the Cistercians were literally the single most hard-working, land-exploiting and sort of agriculturally productive, husbandry connected sort of landscape molders of medieval Europe. Like, it was probably a thing of their order. They bred war horses for the Crusaders. And the author says here, and the poor people of Poland struggled to till the sandy soil with primitive wooden plows devoid of iron. This is also very progressivistic and technologistic, say, look, these guys can't work the land because they don't have the right plow. Obviously, it's had barely anything to do with this. Bohemia, for example, was one of the first. It was actually apparently I talked about this, I don't remember in which video, the land that developed the heaviest plow during the High Middle Ages, and hardly because it was more technologically advanced than other lands, as a matter of fact. So why in Bohemia and not somewhere else? That's also an interesting question. Just note some of the most fertile lands didn't even need that more advanced technology, but even though the plow technology specifically, even though they were dramatically more advanced, basically at anything, and so never make simple dichotomies in this regard. The source says, so the Poles were unable to harness the power of multiple oxen or cows. Well, maybe because they didn't have them, right? Or at least they didn't have them, in the quantity that would allow them just to be able to use to develop these plows for them, right? And as a result, their agricultural efficiency was severely limited. The people lacked even the most basic necessities, and this sort of makes the point, including salt, iron, coins, and metal goods. This is depicting the Poles as savages, basically. Their attire consisted only of rough, homespun clothing and worn-out shoes. The only livestock they possessed were oxen. It was the monks who first stumbled upon this unexplored land, and through their efforts it was fully uncovered. Naturally, some Polish peasant would have had something to say about this, but this is not very distant from the general level of absolute material poverty and misery. And consider again that, especially after the Mongol invasions, there had been traumatically severe devastations, right, that had impacted deeply, like in the entire country, that there were so many people in the first place, even just before that, living in poverty. Central Europe was backwards. And here the Cistercian is taking pride of course, mostly the monastic achievements, etc. And so it's a bit of a biased source. But consider even this as a sort of embryo of modern thinking, right, regarding to technological development, economics, etc. And of course, it's an exaggerated expression of local pride. In the 15th century, the Poles, along with others, used similar descriptions to describe the Lithuanians. And also in that case, they weren't that far from the truth. Like, Lithuania was much more like backwards country than Poland. We've seen it also at the military level, and again, the entire scheme of things, like the entire political military relations, they speak for themselves. This thing has always been among humans. We will compete on the base of groups, and our identities developing from that, and they are malleable, but they are also kind of true. Like, you cannot pretend that differences do not exist, and as such, something is better than and something is worse, right? That's mathematics. It's not what a person thinks. That at some levels is objectively also, irrelevant. So cultural blending occurred, as we explained, also on an institutional level. When, for example, Conrad of Mazovia established Plock in 1237, he combined elements of German law, which granted autonomous jurisdiction under a Schwerpunkt, as we've seen, a Schwerpunkt, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, with the Polish knights' law that had previously been granted to merchants. This is also telling, because you see that there is some level of mix of the various estates, in part on the basis of how the national character would be of different weight as the same social hierarchy, but from the respective countries. It's something you have to consider, that what was a Polish knight, right, may have been, as we've seen also in the military historical unit videos, like something less costly, right, cheaper, less effective than, say, a German knight. And this could be assimilated to a third estate, or to some extent, right? There were some levels of knighthood that we find in the sources of Hungary, for example, and just making some research about this, that by the 12th century talk about knights for horse archers that definitely are not the full Panzer Ritter, like, etc. So in this case in Mazovia, that was of course to become very important in Polish history because Warsaw was developing from there, but at this time was one of the least developed parts of Poland. Witnesses this interesting blending, this practical intelligence from the side of the rulers, and this also mixing between the various elements. This tells you how far east, of course, the Germans would arrive, and there's really no limit. This happened also in Lithuania, to some lesser extent in the Rus, to some lesser extent. We see it clearly. We've seen it in the video about Ruthenian warfare, and how many German arms and armor the Rus princes imported regularly. They preferred them over the Byzantine or the steppes stuff, right? We know of some German knights being settled in the Rus at the time as well. So in this region, the cultural influence of the newcomers is evident in language. We're recalling how German terms were adopted to describe objects, concepts, occupations, tools, this does not necessarily imply that Poles were unfamiliar with these matters prior to the arrival of the Teutonic influences. Instead, it is a fact that Polish terminology was replaced, even in certain areas, with words such as szwagier, meaning brother-in-law, supplanting Javerz, małżeństwo, meaning marriage, replacing svadbe, and tańczyć, meaning to dance, to tanzen, taking place the place of plasacz. So you see, these are Polonized German terms. Nevertheless, they substitute themselves to the ethnic Slav terminology. And for sort of important things, I mean, brother-in-law, marriage, okay, dancing, admittedly not much, but consider the folklore of medieval Poland. It would have been colorful and gracious, even among the peasantry. It was important for them, evidently, and so here the German trace is so strong you can't unsee it. The tradition of dousing women with water on Easter Monday, known as Schminkus Dingus, was adopted by the Poles under German influence as well, albeit this practice originated itself further west. We know of also some chivalric and feudal models. Courtly etiquette flourished, for example, in Krakow, Poznan, Wrocław, because, of course, the higher the level, the more you wanted to act as, the nobility of the empire that was next door and was advanced and powerful, and everybody was interested in it. And the more, the richer, the more refined you looked, and the more political weight you had, and you had to invest, you had to spend for it. So it was fueling all a cycle of further economy, of the same German production, the same participation of the Polish labor. It was important. That's how this cultural blending occurred. The Chronicle of Greater Poland includes a legend about nuptial infidelity that is based on the actual Nibelungenlied. The motive of it, the native romance of Walterus Robustus, also known as Dalus Balcerz, and Elgunda. That is the look there. In as you understand here, like German names, and Polonized German ones. Henry IV of Silesia was particularly renowned for organizing tournaments, sort of the Western fashion at his court. The Slavs had their own forms of, equestrian games and evolutions and all this kind of stuff. But let's say the most updated way to go at it was the tournament with like the heavier knights. In the 14th century, that there is the Italian joust that introduces the palisades in between the two knights. So there is all some gradual absorption, especially from at an elite level. There, of course, the average person, like the majority, and the peasantry at large, as a consequence, would remain unequivocally Slavic, right? So we don't have to be that. But that's filtered, that's substratum, right? Or say superstratum of Germanness was definitely injected, and it definitely constitutes still today an important part of these countries' national identities, and it cannot be denied, as much as, of course, like Central European cultures as a whole. So in Germany, it's very influenced by the Slavic world, the Magyar world. And so this video was just a reminder of this, and we will keep talking about this. We'll talk about, of course, the broader area, we will talk about the influence of in fact the Slavic and the mutual influence of the Slavic and the German worlds. We will talk about the political and institutional development of Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and also properly in relation with Germany as well, and also the broader surrounding. We have to talk more about the Scandinavian connections, the Russian connections. We have to talk about, as a matter of fact, a lot of things. The video, however, is pretty much it. I hope that you enjoyed this one. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.